guys, and welcome back to the question where you have the questions and I have the answers. And today we are not going to be talking about the Second Amendment because there are more relevant and more important issues to be talked about. I'll get to whether we are allowed to have guns or not eventually, but right now this is way more important than the right to bear arms. The BLM protests over the summer had a major impact on my school's curriculum. We started learning about a lot more Black creators and reading a lot more of their content, listening to a lot more to their music, which are also relevant for today. And today we were going to be listening to and reading Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech, which basically discusses how women are fighting for equal rights, but it's only really white women who are getting attention, getting respect, and who are only fighting for themselves. And this is still prevalent in today's society where it's like feminism, we think of a white movement. In all of feminist movements out history, we think of white people. We don't really think of Black women as being part of those or even being included. And my teacher was introducing Sojourner Truth, and she said, she is a former slave who then went on to become an abolitionist and a women's rights activist. She was a feminist, and that is one of the most memorable things about her, what she's most known for. And I said the fact that she started out with she's a former slave, and that's what we were all thinking, shows that that's not what she was known for. And that proves her point that in feminism and other social movements, we don't think of Black people first. We don't think of them as being part of those movements. We think of Black people, we think of Black history, we think of that slavery first. And not to say, this is not saying that we should not discuss slavery, that we should not teach slavery in school. Slavery is a terrible thing, and the fact that it happened needs to be remembered. I'm saying that this is a bad thing. We need to always remember that that's something that happened. We cannot overlook the bad parts in our history. But we need to stop this speaking of Black historical figures and modern, Black figures and the Black community as if that's what defines them. That the only important thing about them, that the most notable thing about them is that they are descended from the people that our, white society and our white ancestors took as slaves from their own continent. That cannot be what we think of first when we think of Black history. Because they have their own rich history. Sojourner Truth, she fought for women's rights, just like, all of the other notable white feminists. Same with Ada B. Wells. There are, Black activists throughout all of the major movements in history, and we never learn about them. And then when we do, we always talk, well, they were either born a slave and then they escaped, or their parents were born a slave, or their grandparents, no matter how far back. And I'm pretty sure it is common knowledge, because this is how we've looked at it for so long, is that, yes, the majority of Black Americans here are descended from slaves. No matter how many generations ago, that is the truth. That is the horrible truth, is that, yeah, that is. Does that mean we have to draw attention to it every single time we talk about an important Black figure, either historically or in the modern day? No, we do not. Should we learn about the slave trade and the terrible things that happened? Yes, but that should not be brought up anytime a Black figure is important or notable. To put this into relative terms, we put the main event of a Black person's life being they were either related to slaves or they escaped from slavery, and then all of the main things that they accomplish afterwards is the aftermath of that Wikipedia article, Instead of, something being early life, and then their main event, and then the aftermath and leading to their death, it's this was this one aspect, and it's what we see in them. And that is, this is part of the core of systemic racism, in ourselves, that internalized racism that people will never fully be able to get away from because they don't realize it, is that we are taught to, even though, we've been mostly equal this time, except for, yes, the systemic things, even though we appear equal, and a lot of us have been learned to be colorblind and not see color and just see the person, which is also very harmful, and I have to learn those things because I was taught that as a kid, because race and color do matter. There are still big differences there, and we have to recognize that in order to fix it. We can't just pretend like it's not there. It's there. Is that the only time they appear in history? That Black community appears in history for most of us, because a lot of schools don't teach about the civil rights movement, is the slave trade, and the Civil War, and then afterwards it's nothing. We don't talk about Reconstruction. We don't talk about, the fight to, once slavery is ended, that doesn't mean everybody was equal. But we only talk about Black people in history when we discuss slavery. And that's wrong, because they were so integral to American society and American history, and they have shaped our politics and they have shaped our political parties. But we don't talk about that. And every single history lesson, every single accomplishment that a Black person, man or woman, or neither, has will always be colored by the fact that they started out as slaves. Whether it was like 2 generations ago or 50 generations ago. So we need to stop including that fact when we talk about Black figures, Either that, or we should start continuing, like, we talk about important white figures, like they were descendants of slave owners, I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about slavery. I'm just saying that it cannot be the defining thing about Black history and about Black people. And whether we like it or not, that is how we think of them. That is how we think of the Black community when we think of these important historical figures, and it shouldn't be. I'm not saying you're a bad person to think like that. I'm saying that we've never been taught that it's wrong. Never even realized we were doing it. I didn't realize I was doing it. When I heard Sojourner Truth today, I thought, oh, she's a former slave, not, oh, she's a women's rights activist. And that doesn't make me a bad person. I didn't know, because who was going to tell me? Who was going to tell me until I figured it out today by myself? The teacher wasn't going to tell me, because she didn't know. The educators don't know. We need to start, integrating these concepts and that true equality and changing our curriculum, because it's coloring our thoughts on other people, and it's coloring our views on history and our views on ourselves in ways we don't know about. So I guess my task for you is to think to yourself, and what are some opinions or some instant reactions that you have that you don't think you knew about, So it's so easy to think that you are this good person, this activist, you want to help everybody and you see everybody as a true equal, but deep down, subconsciously, it's not even your fault, This racism, this inequality, this homophobia, transphobia, everything is so deeply ingrained in there. Like, my friend texted me and he said, did you know an African American is not the richest man in the world? And I immediately heard African American and thought, oh, a Black person. But those two things are not the same, because Elon Musk is from South Africa. He is technically an African American, and he is the richest man in the world, but he is not Black. It's those small subconscious things that are, racist and prejudiced thoughts. But that does not make you racist and or prejudiced unless you act on them. And you may not even be aware that you're acting on them. Like, once again, I was not aware that I held these prejudices. Now I am, and I'm trying very hard to condition myself to not have those thoughts. And it's not going to be easy. You can't just be like, oh, I am aware of this, so I'm not like that anymore. No, it's hard, because this is something that's been ingrained to you since you were like a kid. Like, I'm 18, and there are people out there who are like 60 or 80 who have not had this realization, who have never had someone be here and say, by the way, we shouldn't be doing this. No one's ever told them that's wrong, and they're probably not going to figure it out for themselves, because it's going to be so much harder for them, because they've been going through their whole lives thinking like this. So yeah, that's all I had to say. I just found that was something that needed to be said, because we don't talk about, any other race like that. Well, we do. We talk about other races. Like, we point out, the disparities in other minorities. We don't do that, with white people. We don't talk about, Mark Twain and be like, yeah, his ancestors were slave owners. But we do go to, Japanese figures and say, oh, Japanese American figures and say, oh, their parents or their grandparents were in internment camps in World War II. If we look at notable Jewish figures and be like, their parents escaped Auschwitz, or, their ancestors were in concentration camps. Maybe they didn't escape. We always talk about that. And we use that as if we define them, like, look, they went through this hard thing and this defines them. And it's always, it's always like at the forefront of our minds. We hear of a minority and when, oh, they went through this great tragedy, and that takes away from the true weight of what they've accomplished. That's why we're recognizing them, like, and I'm not saying we should forget these. We should never forget the Holocaust. We should never forget the Japanese internment. We should never forget mass deportation of, Mexican Americans. We should not forget the slave trade. But I'm saying we should not be defining these subsequent minorities, the resulting minorities, by these atrocities that happened a long time ago. And we shouldn't be defining the notable people of that day by, once again, the atrocities that happened to them. People aren't famous for overcoming such a tragedy, famous for the things, we're recognizing them for what they did after the fact. Sojourner Truth isn't famous because she escaped slavery. Many slaves escaped slavery, She's famous for doing that and then using her voice for good, for furthering women's rights and advocating for this thing that is still an issue in today's society. We aren't, if I were to be famous, I am not famous because I have family who died in Auschwitz. I'm famous for what I did. And whether I'm Jewish or not, that should not matter who my ancestors were and what happened to them, because I'm doing what I'm doing, Yeah, I don't know. I just feel like history shapes so much more of what we are as a society than we let on. And this is part of it. How we are taught history shapes how we think about others and how we think about history and how we think about these other things. And that could be a good or a bad thing. We may not even realize it. So thank you for your time. So long and thanks for all the fish. And have a wonderful day. Be excellent to each other and party on, dudes.